Hey there, my name's Mark McCartney, and welcome to the What is a Good Life podcast. Over the last 3 years, I've interviewed over 200 people around this question, not to prescribe you with the universal answer, but to help you to find and define your own answer to this question. I'm hoping the guests' musings, explorations, curiosities, and experiences will prompt your own inquiry into what this question means to you. While I'm also trying to share with you what I perceive to be more genuine expressions of the human experience, and indeed more meaningful conversations. Which brings us to this week and the 82nd episode of the What is a Good Life podcast. And I'm delighted to introduce our guest, Parneet Pal. Parneet is a Harvard and Columbia trained physician-educator who teaches skills and communicates ideas that advance personal, workplace, and planetary health. She is the founder of Systematically Well Advisory Inc, where she applies her expertise to enhance health and performance and their impact on business leadership. Her goal is to make you fall in love with your biology so that it works for you, your work, and the planet. She works with business teams and global organizations to address workplace stress, burnout, loneliness, and sustainability. Parneet speaks at global conferences such as Web Summit and TED Countdown, and guest lectures at several universities including Harvard, Columbia, and Stanford. She has been a TEDMED scholar, a Harvard Business Review contributor, and has been featured on the cover of Mindful magazine. In this enlightening conversation, Parneet shares her explorations of what true health is, moving away from siloed approaches to consider social, economic, ecological, and environmental factors. She shares remarkable insights from what our biology suggests a good life is, as well as major realizations that she has made in her own life in relation to nature, community, mindfulness, and compassion. This whole conversation is full of life-affirming messages around the wonder, design, and miracle of life itself. Parneet is an absolute fountain of knowledge and embodied compassion, and this episode will fill you with gratitude to simply exist in this world and for the very life we live. I personally found this conversation to be extremely enlightening and uplifting and full of life-affirming confirmations from biology, and so I think you're going to take a lot from this episode. And if you enjoy this conversation, please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. Or if you're on the podcasting platforms, I'd greatly appreciate a favorable review, as it really helps me at this stage of my podcasting journey. Please check out the show notes below for ways of finding out more of Parneet's work, as well as links for contacting me and indeed the podcast newsletter. That's all I have to say for this week. I look forward to carrying on the conversation with you next week. So without further ado, the 82nd episode of the What is a Good Life podcast. Parneet, thank you so much for joining us today on the What is a Good Life podcast. Since being made aware of your work by a friend and listening to a number of your talks, I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with you today.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. Likewise, I'm really excited to have a conversation and see where it takes us.
Wonderful. So, as you know, I kick it off with the question of, is there a question you're trying to answer as you move through life?
Yeah, I mean, I think like everyone else, I've grappled with questions around meaning and purpose and impact in my life. Questions around why do bad things happen to good people? And that's taken me down many different paths. But I think the one through line or the thread, both personally and professionally, that exploration of those questions have taken me on is an exploration of health, and looking at health and biology and life. And by life, I mean biological life, um, and trying to see what does true health actually mean and what is my role in it, and sort of a discovery and rediscovery of my role in enhancing health and well-being.
So, just the question then of like, what is true health? What does that look like for you?
Yeah. So there's a definition that the World Health Organization has outlined, and I think it's a very boring definition, but I think it's quite a comprehensive definition of health. And they define health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just an absence of disease. And when you start to investigate the layers of physical, mental, and social well being, and especially the social determinants of health, you come upon the fact that the economy and the ecology and environment is included in there. And I think that's a fantastic way to think about how health is an emergent property of the systems that we live in. And unfortunately, both the way that health has been looked at in healthcare, and I think just in our general zeitgeist, we tend to have a very narrow, siloed approach to health and well being. So I just love the idea of expanding that outlook and taking some time to rediscover what is it that actually makes the cells in my body sing, and what are those interactions with the systems that I place myself in, that either lead to um, energy, focus, creativity, meaningful relationships, or the opposite.
That's a glorious sentence, isn't it? What is it that makes my cells sing? Uh, what comes up for you when you contemplate the sense of that?
Yeah. So I'm a bit of a science geek. So when I think of cells singing, I literally in my mind's eye, I see my mitochondria, and I see specifically as I'm talking to you, I'm thinking of this one clip I found on YouTube not so long ago of an immunofluorescent staining of a live cell, live human cell. I think it was one of the immune cells, and the mitochondria was stained green, as is common with that kind of staining, but it was live in action. So you could see it was basically the cell appearing very dark. And then there was the dark nucleus inside, and the nucleus is a place where all of our genetic information is stored. And then surrounding that dark nucleus were these filaments of mitochondria that were green. And what was really stunning for me was to see them in action, live in action, and to see them moving. And something that mitochondria do is that they fuse, and there's fusion and fission happening. So they combined, they come together and they separate depending on the needs of the cell. And they tend to cluster around the nucleus because they're really important in relaying information to the nucleus, and taking information away from it to keep us healthy. So, so when I think of like a singing cell, I visualize my mitochondria just like having a little bit of a party in there, and just like high-fiving each other, and being like, yay, it's time to connect with the nucleus. And then not in that specific slide, but I know that in the cell, the mitochondria are also connecting with the Golgi apparatus and the endoplasmic reticulum, and these are sites in the cell that produce proteins and other important chemicals. And I know that within mitochondria, there are literally hundreds of thousands of chemical reactions around metabolism that are happening, including the Krebs cycle, which is sort of the underpinning, the miracle of life itself. And so. Yeah, for me, a cell that sings is one where everybody's happy, everybody's talking to one another. And we also now know that um, some mitochondria are cell free. So we found mitochondria that migrate outside of cells, which is stunning. So it appears that there might be, and we don't know that much about it yet, but it appears that they might be these not just intracellular, but intercellular communicators that go wherever energy is needed in the body. So very exciting. So I see that system that's really thriving, and then the mitochondria are talking to the microbiome, and all is well in the body.
That sounds absolutely glorious. the, the sense for you of just this question, even around health. I know you mentioned just that definition, even from the World Health Organization, and just the significance as well of the environment and a social component as well. Just from your perspective, what are some of the kind of the key elements to this that you're noting either in your work, in your own life, and in terms of the significance of the intertwining or the significance even of environment and the social aspect of life?
Well, that's all that I'm noticing at the moment, actually, or a huge part of what I'm noticing. And so, and again, I can talk about this for hours, but the um, I think one of the key takeaways is that when we talk about the environment and when we talk about climate and sustainability, often there is a tendency to separate that from our notions of what's happening inside our body. But the more that we learn about these interactions, the more we realize that it's truly inseparable. And again, I know that a lot of us have an intuitive sense of our interconnection, the fact that both, we are connected to each other via community, but then as human beings, we're connected to other living beings and the planet. But when we take a look at the biological and molecular underpinnings of this connection, I think it just makes it even more beautiful and emphasizes the importance of the fact that health and sustainability are really two sides of the same coin. Um, and just to sort of set a framework, it's these, I like to think of mitochondria as the chief sustainability officers in our cells. And essentially what they're doing is their function is basically to keep us healthy. And by the way, all of our cells, for folks who may not be familiar with mitochondria, um, each cell has hundreds, sometimes thousands of mitochondria. These are ancient bacteria that were co-opted by multicellular organisms way back billions of years ago. And they are present in cells of human beings, of animals, of plants. And they function they're popularly known as sort of the cell batteries, but they're actually uh, way more important in the cell. So they produce energy, yes, but they're kind of like these masterminds that balance growth and repair in our cells. So essentially, the way that our social life and our environment interacts with our health is that everything that we are exposed to, and the technical term for that is the exposome, um, all of our life exposures, starting from the womb, from the moment of conception till the day that we die, the physical, chemical, social, environmental, psychological exposures that we have influence, they are received by our cells. And then our cells have to respond in some way to those stressors, right? And in order to maintain a safe operating zone for our bodies, it's a very narrow zone of pH and temperature and glucose that the body, where the cells can sing. And in order to maintain that balance, uh, the energy that we produce in the cells has to be calibrated, right? Turn it up or turn it down. Um, if uh, if there's a stressor that's particularly threatening, then the body has to respond and make sure that if it's inflicting any kind of injury, that injury needs to be repaired. And so there's this constant calibrating and balancing act that the cells are involved in that's keeping us alive. And thankfully, it's happening unconsciously. We're not aware of it. But it's a really, really complex process. And how we interact with others, you know, depending on the quality of our relationships with others, but also depending on the quality of the environments that we expose ourselves to, the end result is either an increase in inflammation in our cells and disease, or a decrease in inflammation and a movement towards health and a longer life. So yeah, and then the relationship moves the other way too. So what we're now discovering is that depending on the levels of inflammation that we have in our body, yes, we will either be sicker or healthier, but then it also affects our ability to make decisions moment to moment. And these moment to moment decisions, I think, we see the fallout very clearly when we think of how we are interacting with our environment, how we're interacting with our communities, the fact that loneliness is becoming, reaching epidemic levels, the fact that we are so stressed out and burnt out at work. When we look at sort of the political landscape and the decisions that we're making at policy level, but also as consumers, and the decisions that we make about our individual health as well. All of those suffer when we don't pay attention to this bidirectional interaction with our social and environmental exposures. Because it gets us stuck in a state of impulsivity, a state of just thinking in the short term and instant gratification.
I'm thinking briefly there as to who I'm causing more inflammation or reduction in inflammation in life to, or who is causing me that as well. This this sense, like, because it's, I don't know, there's some elements to this where I I often think, and it's interesting you use the word, obviously, the word unconscious when it comes to all this interactions or these movements in our cells, either towards inflammation or away from it. But the kind of cut off sense we have even from a lot of external events that are happening, or even, I think we're living in a very psychological age almost. It's not even the things that are necessarily happening in our life, but just the sheer level of access we have to so many things, and so many things potentially going wrong. Even you mentioned burnout there. I think even just people having access to their emails and work, or to be contacted. Like, I'm 40 now. When I started off in banking in my early 20s, it was just the senior people that had, that took their work home with them. This sense for you of what is it about even the quality of a relationship, or that would underpin the quality of a relationship that would be more conducive, let's say, to reducing the sense of inflammation within us?
So I'm immediately thinking of a study that was done a few years ago. I'm not sure if it's been replicated, but it was a pretty landmark piece of research when it came out from Barbara Fredrickson, and that was used in Dr. Steve Cole's research. And Dr. Steve Cole is the director of social genomics at UCLA. And I would urge anyone who's interested in this area to go look up his work. He's just done some phenomenal work in this space. And they basically were looking at what are the effects to our immune system, to our long-term health, to levels of inflammation when we come from childhoods of trauma or poverty, or even in our adulthood when we're confronted with loneliness, or when we are engaging in relationships that are not life affirming. And what was interesting, and we can talk about sort of like the regular effects that they found. But one takeaway was that when we engage in relationships solely for our benefit, when it's only about me progressing in life, achieving something, fame, status, money, whatever the case might be, or consuming and acquiring all the pleasures in life, then on a psychological survey, you might answer in a particular way, and you might say, "Yeah, life is amazing. Life is really good. Everything's hunky dory." But then when we look at your cells and when we look at the state of your immune system, it tells a very different story compared to somebody who may not have that amount of money, who may not have as much pleasure in their life, but who has more meaning in their life, and whatever way that they acquire their meaning. And usually the way that they do that is by giving to others, by being of service to others, by engaging in a mission that is bigger than themselves. And their cells respond in a very different way. So they might score on that psychological survey. They might answer the same way as the hedonic kind of inclination, which is, yeah, life is good. I feel satisfied. I feel happy most of the time. I feel gratitude in my life. But their cellular structures share a very different story. So the hedonic expression, and this is, if you want to know the technical name, it's called the conserved transcriptional response to adversity, which is this evolutionarily conserved way that our immune system responds to threat. And typically, what it does is that it increases inflammatory molecules, and it primes our body to fight um, infection or bacterial infection specifically. Because back in the day when we were hunters and gatherers, that was what would kill us. Viruses were not that threatening back then, just yet. And it tones down our antiviral response. So this is a typical conserved response that we see in our present day anytime we're exposed to psychological or physical or any other kinds of stressors. So in the short term, this is a good thing. You want this kind of response so your body can protect itself. But if this kind of response persists, it's not a good thing, because this leads to chronic inflammation. If your response to viruses goes down, so you're more prone to viral diseases, and it's also sort of the starting point for all kinds of chronic lifestyle related diseases, which is what kills us these days. So, really interesting to see that the hedonic profile, immune profile, mapped onto this kind of chronic inflammatory response, whereas the eudaimonic immune profile was very different. So, even though those people perhaps were facing a lot of challenge in their lives, just by the fact that they found more meaning in their life, or the fact that they gave to others, and sort of had this bigger purpose in their lives, their cells responded. Their mitochondria said, yes, this is the essence. We are social creatures. This is what we were made for. We have to look out for one another. And the fallout is that inflammation was much lower, their immunity was higher, and they lived longer. So I love that, and I don't even know how I got what your original question was, but when I think of that kind of profile, I think it's just beautiful that the way that our biology has been designed, it's sort of it shows us the way that we need to be living our lives, and that our biology rewards us when we take care of each other.
That's one of the most glorious things I've heard. That's really, really beautiful, though, isn't it? Like it's like we can talk about having certain values. We can mention the significance of meaning, kind of even more from a philosophical place, or maybe even from if your experience or exposure is to certain religions or certain values of those as well. To hear though, even just on the like on the cellular level, that this is what's actually being almost encouraged or rewarded, that sounds, I don't know, I just think that sounds absolutely delightful.
Yeah, and it makes sense, right, Mark? Because in order to stay alive, your mitochondria, your microbiome know that they wouldn't be able to exist without the people and the plants and the air and the water and the soil around you. I mean, you literally need those things for the basic survival of the human body. So I think the way our biology has been designed is exquisite. And my hope and my wish is that if one thing comes out of this conversation is that people get excited about their biology and they get curious about their biology and they want to explore that a little bit more and start to see how that shows up in their personal lives through the lens of their own health and well-being, but also then hopefully starting to have these conversations around, well, if that's true for me as an individual, what does this mean for the health of my workplace? What does this mean for the health of my community? And what does this mean for the health of our planet?
Has there been a moment in your various studies, your career, where you've discovered something that has, like, fundamentally, and I don't mean you personally, but just even if it's some research that you come across, or something that you've created yourself, where it's fundamentally changed how you approach life, or that you how you engage with life?
Well, so many things, honestly. One of the things, even though I'm not in clinical practice anymore, I did go to medical school and I did do my medical residency and I was in clinical practice for a little bit. I think that the best thing that happened there, because the reason I moved away from clinical practice was because it just didn't align with my notion of what true healthcare should look like, or uh, what I thought my best contribution could be to enabling health. But the best thing that came out of it was understanding physiology and biology at a deeper level. And there's every single aspect of how our organ systems operate is mind blowing. So it's hard for me to sort of pick one particular moment, but I'll share I'll share the point where it made me move from thinking of just the body to thinking of the body as part of nature rather than separate from nature. And this was through a book. It was I don't know. Have you read Cradle to Cradle?
And no, I haven't. No.
So it's an out of print book now. I believe it was released around 2002, 2003, and it was this tiny book. It was made with this easily recyclable or composting paper and soy ink. It was just sort of very ahead of its time in terms of like the materials that it was made with. And the authors were Bill McDonough, who's an architect, and Michael Braungart, a chemical engineer. And they are known as sort of like the forefathers of what is now the circular economy. And in that book, they basically talked about the principles that nature uses to function, and hence the concept of cradle to cradle, because there's absolutely no waste in nature. So, what is waste is converted to food. They talked about the principles of abundance in nature, the fact they talked about biodiversity, and how nature functions on the principles of collaboration. And it just and for me back then, and this was, I was just coming out of medical residency and sort of in clinical practice and feeling really disillusioned with the way healthcare was being practiced, and when we were just ignoring all this data around lifestyle and prevention, which is sort of the true essence of health. And I had no concept of the climate or sustainability. I had never even thought about those topics. I grew up in Bombay, which was a very, very urban center. I hardly spent any time in nature. And reading that book was it just I literally had to pause and stop and say, wait a second, what do you mean by there's abundance in the world? What the hell do you mean by waste equals food? Like, what is happening here? What do you mean we don't need to compete and it's better to collaborate? I mean, these were such foreign ideas for me back then, because I had been trained a particular way, even when thinking about health and the body. And so that was my first sort of introduction to this idea that my body is part of nature. Of course it is. I mean, now it's sort of more like a duh kind of understanding, but back then it was a revelation. And then that's helped me to then start thinking about, okay, what's actually happening inside the cells. And lo and behold, when you look at how cells function, they function on exactly the same principles. So there's recycling and waste that's being turned into food and energy sources in our cells. So there's a little bit of a circular economy going on in our cells as well. Our cells collaborate with each other, with different organs, with our microbiome, with all the external exposures that we've talked about. The fact that our body thrives on biodiversity. We get into trouble, we fall sick when we have a lack of biodiversity within our microbiome or the exposures that we have in our lives. So really, really beautiful. And that helped me to start shifting my notion of what it means to be truly healthy and well. Yeah.
What was the and I want to pick up this again, the part of the body being part of nature, not as something separate to it. What was it like then to train, to be in kind of clinical practice and then to step away from that? Like, was that Was that a moment in life where you were just so compelled by what you were discovering? Was it such an aversion to what you were witnessing, or how did you experience that?
I experienced it as a quarter life crisis. I mean that. It was truly a
No,
very,
I'm just laughing at my own third life crisis, but but you got there sooner than I did.
yeah, and not to say that wasn't my my only crisis, but it certainly was my first one. And and now I can laugh about it, but back then it was a very very dark moment for me because I was grappling with um, the fact that things didn't make sense to me anymore. Up until then, my life path had been very straight. I sort of knew what was going to come next. Um, and everything was going according to plan. And then suddenly I was confronted with this knowledge that one, feeling this discomfort around what I'm doing with my life or how I'm operationalizing the information or the knowledge that I have learned in terms of healthcare. I had no idea what I would do with that knowledge if it wasn't clinical practice. So that was a big crisis point because I come from a very humble background in India. Had worked really really hard and made it to amazing schools in North America. There was a lot of time and energy that had been invested, and suddenly at this point I was confronted with giving all that up and not knowing what the hell I would do with all that knowledge, and how I would survive as well, right? Like I didn't have any trust funds to rely on, so that was really confronting. And then the other thing that was happening around the same time was a lot of illness in my immediate and extended family that just sort of came out of the blue. So it was a very interesting time for me to be, on the one hand, confronted with disease and illness that was chronic, that caused a lot of suffering to my family, and that required modern medicine. Um, and at the same time, not knowing how I wanted to enact this kind of shift in my thinking that I was experiencing around health.
How did you? Because that sounds like I don't know, like such a big moment in terms of, as you say, you work really hard, you get into these amazing schools. I can only imagine the identity, like the identifying myself with whatever is going on in my life. Then in terms of just like, oh, and then there being such kind of clarity, I guess, with a route that, albeit that is no longer resonating. How did you kind of develop a plan or a way out of it, or did it come spontaneously? How did that develop for you?
I did not react well. I didn't know, honestly. I didn't know what to do with. I was dealing with a lot of difficult emotions. I wouldn't say I was depressed, but I was definitely in feeling a lot of despair about my future, about my family's health, about the state of the world. And one of the ways that so I didn't have a plan. So everything that followed and the next, I just started taking one step at a time and start keeping sort of that North Star in mind about, I want to enable health and well-being. I want to be able to use my strengths to hopefully scale that in one way or the other as much as I could. But first, I knew I had to navigate my difficult emotions properly because I was not responding well. And of course, also just feeling, there was a lot of, I wasn't the only person who was upset. Everybody in my family was upset with the decisions that I had made, but then they were also grappling with some very hard questions around health and suffering. Um, and it was the practice of compassion and mindfulness that really steadied me. And growing up in India, it was something that I was very familiar with. So meditation and yoga was something that my family practiced, and that it's just sort of in our DNA when you grow up in India, as you know, because I know you've traveled through India. But I wasn't. I wasn't embodying those practices at all. Um, and so this was, I think it was a really good moment for me. It was a good trigger for me to first dive deep into the techniques. So I started exploring different techniques of mindfulness, everything from, I tried everything. So like the little sampling of the concentration practices and body awareness practices, and let me try transcendental meditation. I wonder what that does to me. And but the practice that really shifted and really was truly helpful was a compassion practice. So it was a practice of metta, of loving kindness, um, that finally was able to quieten my overly analytical mind, and but also give me that sense of relief that I hadn't been able to find anywhere. And it was interesting, Mark, because as I look back now, I realized that during that time of struggle, uh, because there was a lot of suffering in my, so by the way, I had gone back to India during this time to kind of sort myself out, but also to be with my family. And so on the one hand, we were navigating the the nitty gritty of the healthcare piece that we were dealing with. But then on the other hand, as I was doing these meditation practices, I just, I don't know where it came from, but I said, I need to volunteer. And I think it was a direct result of the compassion practice, I want to say. I can't remember the exact sequence of events, but I think that was probably, I had never even thought of volunteering before ever in my life, unfortunately. But that was the one time where, I just started volunteering at a nonprofit in Bombay, and we were basically, I was teaching math and English to kids in some of the slum neighborhoods in Bombay, and that was a very healing. Um, it was more healing than I can put words to, and it was kind of interesting because when I started out, I was like, yeah, these poor kids, I'm gonna help them here,
Right.
and boy, was I wrong. It was such a precious time for me, just the few months that I was there and I was volunteering, because I had an opportunity to spend most of the day in the classroom, but then we had an opportunity to spend time with them uh, in their homes. And it was just, and you've been, what slums in Bombay look like. Uh, and just in those conditions, I was just blown away by, first, how resilient these kids were despite growing up in those very, very tragic environments, um, how happy they were in many ways. And maybe happy is not the correct word, but just how joyful they were in those circumstances, how open they were, how loving they were. Um, so yeah, so I get very emotional when I think about that, because I didn't help them at all. Maybe they learned a little more math and maybe they spoke a little better English, but honestly, they helped me the most. They helped me to sort of shift my center of gravity and stop kind of like, you know, I finally realized that, I wasn't the center of the universe. and, and yeah, I will forever remain indebted to the love, care, compassion that spending time with these kids gave me. And hopefully it was better for my health too. I know it was better for my health.
That's isn't that so beautiful though? The even the approach of, you know, finding, I guess, some sort of sense of compassion even through your own practice, but then that it moved you to action. You know, like that it wasn't just here's my individual practice that I'll do each day, and then it kind of just stays where within that practice itself. When you actually see some change occurring in us when it goes out into the external world or in relation to other people, I think that's where that's for what I consider the real beauty of a lot of these practices, is when you see someone move not just from a morning routine kind of very self-focused process, but that you can actually see that it's planted seeds that have led to either a connection developing or an interaction with other people. I think that's what I find this at it's kind of its most beautiful.
Exactly. And I'm curious, I mean, because I know you have had a lot of experience with these practices, and you've spent a lot of time in India as well. So I'm just curious, how did that show up for you as you were traveling or through these practices? Did something stand out for you?
Yeah, well, I think you've hit the nail on the head there too. Just what it can do to be in circumstances where you see people have far less than I did, and that joyful aspect that you touch on there. Like I also spent time a number of years ago in kind of shanty towns outside of Cape Town, where we were told again that if children had runny noses, it might mean their immune system is shot, so that they may either their parent may have had HIV or something of this nature. And I remember I'm always stunned by that image in my head of playing like football or running around with some of these kids, and just my head couldn't put the pieces the picture together, if you know what I mean. Because like yourself again, I maybe I go in with an assumption that I'm going to be perceiving I'm going to maybe even be solemn, or that I'll have to be respectful of a sadness present, or something to this effect. So I think for me, traveling around India was definitely a huge eye opener in that sense. Um, with the but then also, like as you say, the surprise of just, I do think that there's something in Western cultures. I remember I had a friend. He became a friend. He was selling art every day. This is outside Rishikesh and Laxmanjula, and he was only 20, and I was 30 or 31 at the time. But he was such a character, and I'd walk past him every day, and he'd invite me in for chai, and would just talk. But I remember at one point he just put his arm around my knee as we were sitting, and for me, I'd never experienced another man just put like making such like affectionate physical contact, if you
Yeah.
know what I mean. And I remember just being surprised at the start, and then it was just like, oh, this is just really nice, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I don't know. For me, there's lots of small moments, like there was Vipassana stuff, there was ashrams and all these things, but I was always so intrigued. Just there's something there's something about the cultures that I think I've grown up in, where I think there's this, whether it's a value thing or maybe it's just the atomized living. I know you've touched on the epidemic of loneliness that's sweeping around as well, but there's something just in how we set things up that keeps us kind of so compartmentalized in elements of our life. And so for me, I think travel, and even one thing I've mentioned before on this podcast, is just spending a year in Peru before I came to Berlin, and just the sense of people always greeting you like, buenos dias, buenas tardes, and then coming to Berlin and wanting to take that with me. So saying guten morgen and moin and whatever friendly hello to people, and just noticing how that's kind of transformed my life here, because now I know everyone, not everyone, that's an exaggeration, but I know a lot of people in my community, even as a foreigner here. Like I know so many people in my day-to-day interactions, just the moment I leave the front door and go to the supermarket, the local cafe. And so that for me is one of the most profound changes in my life, of just a sense of building or cultivating actual community. And I do think a lot of the I do think, let's say, a lot of mindfulness practice kind of opens up a portal, perhaps within us, maybe to connect with or realizing the importance, or maybe even realizing the interconnectivity of us, the interdependence between us. So I think it probably follows a similar kind of inception for you as well. It starts maybe with some mindfulness practices, but then it becomes, I don't know, it becomes so much bigger than that. Like you start to see the interconnection of everything, even just the acknowledgement of breath in and breath out, and how that, like I'm breathing in the world and I'm breathing out the world with each breath. Like just so many subtle things like this where I don't know, it really becomes unfathomable to me how I could live such a disconnected life, or to think, when you mentioned earlier about like a hedonistic lifestyle, and then also, but the impact of meaning on our lives, like the impact even on the cellular level of that. And so for me, I think that's the most important things. The concentration, focus, yes, all good things, but they seem pretty, not whimsical, if you know what I mean. Like, but because we live in a very distracted world, but they seem a little bit whimsical to me in terms of just like the depth of connection that's available. Like, you mentioned earlier as well, just the quality of the relationships in our lives will have a profound effect on our health. And I think some of these tools, whether it's through the compassion aspect, the paying attention, holding someone in attention, seeing them fully, I think these are things that I've taken from those practices into my everyday life that I think make a huge difference for me.
Yeah, no, really beautifully said. Yeah, I completely hear you on that. And I think one of the things that I've definitely, one I noticed many different things when I moved from India to live in North America, but the one thing that has stood out for me to this day is just how, as you were mentioning, the emphasis on community in India is just, again, it's just part of the culture, and something that I took for granted. And it's only, now living in North America where everything seems so separate. You have to be really intentional about building community, whereas it sort of it's comes more naturally in a sense. Everybody is part of your extended family in India. Everybody's an auntie and uncle, um, and this was really brought to um, light for me again when my parents passed away, uh, and I saw sort of like the rallying around the community where they lived, in that moment, and the love, the support, um, that was just given so freely, and with so much. It was so genuine. I felt that kind, especially at a time when you're grieving. Yeah, again, I was just blown away by um, that sense of connection and community. So, and it's something that I definitely feel missing in many times, in my life in North America for sure. Yeah.
I think there's something kind of stunning about the human experience that, and it's definitely been made apparent to me through interviewing so many people, whether in the project before this or for the podcast, like that life for humanity has the capacity to show you something so stunningly beautiful, even in, like, our deep, well, especially sometimes in our deepest grief, that you could witness this response from a community, but also, to use the word, genuine. And it makes it almost sound like an effortless thing, like just
Mhm.
an effortless, unconditionally kind of loving thing.
Exactly. It was because it was who they were, right? They were just. I mean, I had so many offerings of, don't worry, like, I'm your mom now, or don't worry, I'll take care of you. Um, yeah, and what more could you ask for in that moment? So I'm really grateful for that, and again, just sort of. One of the things that you said around, during meditation, you breathe the world in and you breathe the world out. And again, I always come down to the biology, and it's um, one of the things that's just so miraculous is how um, plants capture, and we've all heard this before, but when you actually look at the chemical reactions, it's stunning. That somewhat, and you can't help but think about, where did this all come from? How did life on this planet emerge? And of course, we don't have all the answers yet, but we have a pretty good idea of the fact that, billions of years ago, in those thermal vents deep down in the ocean, somehow, iron and sulfur and carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus came together to start to build nucleotides, the building basic building blocks for DNA and RNA, which then ultimately go on to become your genes. um, and that was sort of the in those really harsh environments, that that alchemy created the first unicellular forms of life, the archaea and the bacteria, and then they came together in, again, sort of like this endosymbiotic, you know seemingly chance occurrence that gave rise to multicellular life, but that also gave rise to what are now mitochondria. And how through and as life progressed, somehow life knew, or plants knew, how to capture the photons, the energy in the photons from the sun, and combine it with carbon dioxide and water to produce sugar and protein and to release oxygen. And then and that release of oxygen enabled oxygen breathing life forms to appear, um, plants and animals, and then human beings. And then to this day, when we sit in that meditation of breathing the world in and out, we are literally breathing in the oxygen that plants are exhaling. And again, another miraculous reaction, the Krebs cycle, is happening in our mitochondria, where our cells just know. And by the way, the Krebs cycle has been conserved as well through millennia. So, this ability to then translate or to break down the food, the sugars and the proteins and fats that we eat in our food, in a systematic way through this kind of oxidation of carbon molecules, where which also involves so many transcription factors and vitamins and micronutrients that we get from the soil and that we get from the air and that we get from our food. And again, miraculously and very precisely, the Krebs cycle works, and it works well most of the time, enough to release, those 36 ATP. ATP is the currency of energy, adenosine triphosphate in our cells. And our bodies can't store ATP, so we have to continuously generate. So your mitochondria have to be on every single moment producing this energy. And this happens, and again, after the Krebs cycle, the oxidation process, electrons are transported through this beautiful electron transport chain that maintains this hydrogen gradient between the inner and outer membranes of the mitochondria. And so it's literally like a battery that is being continuously charged inside of our cells. And that process then goes towards giving us energy, so that we wake up in the morning and do everything and have the conversations that we're having, so that we can sit in meditation, that we can do the work in the world that we need to do. But then that energy is also diverted for protein synthesis, which allows us to grow and to develop and to repair and regenerate when we are confronted with infection and injury. And this process is happening seamlessly in our cells. Um, yeah, I mean, if that is not miraculous, I don't know what is.
Yeah, but there's so many things. There's so many things you've shared that just give a real. Well, first of all, it sounds like there's almost like a poetry or an art to the process itself, or like something magical to it, and also just so many things you just pointed to there, which is just the basic functioning of the world almost, but that it it almost makes you say, like, it makes me sound grateful to be, it makes me feel very grateful to be alive, just hearing that this is all what's occurring. Or there's some kind of element to it that sounds so reassuring as well, that this is, there's a beautiful, there's a beautiful design or a beautiful support or a beautiful interconnection of everything that's occurring. And it does make me, I must say, a little bit sad just to think even of how we can then make so many choices that either even the notion that you mentioned earlier of realizing you weren't separate from nature. I think a lot of people would still probably consider themselves to be somewhat separate from nature. The choices that we make, that given all these interdependencies, and even just what you were saying earlier about the, increasing inflammation or decreasing inflammation, that there's so many things that we just decide to do that could increase the inflammation. And it makes me very grateful that you've stayed with your North Star, and you've transitioned your way through medical school into continuing to speak with such passion and beauty about this as well. But just given the time, Parneet, just given so many things that you've shared, like around the importance of, obviously, the question of, like, even what is true health, the importance that you point to of meaning, of relationships, the realizing the interdependence or interconnections even between our social environment, let alone our, like, ideas of the wider environment and sustainability and how that can contribute to our own good life. The quality of relationships, even the wonderful example you gave of just the significance of volunteering and intentionally going out into the world to contribute, and lo and behold, you receive so much back in different ways as well. Just really curious to hear your answer to the question of what is a good life for you.
Yeah, I thought about that, and I want to answer it in a couple of different ways. So, when I think of a good life, and this is something that I'm sure you've heard before, this phrase, um, is having something to do, someone to love, and something to look forward to. So I think that's a good, if you have those things, that's a pretty good life. I think, and in order to get there, I think, just based on everything that we've talked about, I think I always try to remember to leave people and situations a little bit better than when you found them. So I think that qualifies as a good life as well. But then the other sort of way that I want to think about it is to just, when we recognize, when we look at life through the lens of biology, and as we've been discussing, when we connect with its complexity and its beauty and its magic, and how miraculous it is, then that question just sort of dissolves, because then you come to the realization that life in itself is good.
That's that's a really, really beautiful way to. I've used that word a few times, but I just think that there is such a. I don't know. There's so much truth to how I felt that anyway. There's just so much truth to that sentiment, and I don't know. I feel, even in the face of, even if people, whatever term people want to use, if it's a meta crisis, if we can look at all of these different, you were mentioning even the issues with loneliness, and there's a plethora of things we can obviously point to, even geopolitical instability and uncertainties, psychological threats that we experience. But I do have this really reassuring sense that life has our back in some way. And I'm not saying that we take a passive role in any of this, but I feel that fundamentally in myself. I feel that maybe even with some of the beliefs that I hold, but there's been something really reassuring about this conversation, even when you're breaking it down to the biological level, that this very much holds true. And that last statement, I think, captures that perfectly.
Yeah, I and for me, it's rather than being passive, at least for me, and I hope for a lot of people, it almost makes me want to protect this life, to nurture this life of my own life, and the lives of the people around me. So I would really encourage folks to just reflect on what that looks like, um, and just be inspired to protect life, which is um, it's miraculous in itself, and I'm always grateful for it. And I'm also grateful for this conversation, Mark. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, Parneet, thank you so much for joining me today on the What is a Good Life podcast. I think I could have had another 100 questions to ask you from all that you've shared, but I'm so grateful for the conversation. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.